Welcome everyone to the penultimate panel of the day on the Ada Lovelace Curated Ethics and Society stage. As Carly says, I'm Sarah Drinkwater and I'm a director at Omidyar Network, a philanthropic venture firm working to fund and fuel the movement towards responsible tech. And to Carly's point, we have a topic that feels so of the moment. In the last few months during lockdown, I'm in California where it's ongoing. We've become more dependent on technology than ever for information, for connection, for diagnosis, for essential deliveries. And that means the largest tech companies have increased their power yet again. All data has become health data. There's this tension at government levels between deploying contact tracing really fast and the necessary challenges that brings. In the last week alone, we've seen Foxglove and Open Democracy force the NHS to release publicly the contracts they've had in place with many different providers. And social media both fuels and holds accountable the perpetrators of state-sanctioned racism in the US. Tech moves faster than the norms that should govern it. And those harms are clearer now than ever before. There's real urgency in how we design a way forwards, but how do we do this without replicating existing power structures? And who should lead the charge? I'm really excited for the conversation that we have. We have about 45 minutes and then a 30-minute Q&A with our speakers afterwards. I would love to ask you to add your questions to Slido and to Facebook. And I would love to welcome Dr. Safiya Noble and Thomas Hughes, who are going to introduce themselves. Thank you. Safiya, perhaps if you'd like to go first.
Sure, thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening for everyone that's watching. I want to just give some opening thoughts just to locate myself in this conversation. It really is often that I'm invited to participate in conversations about the ethics or the goodness and harms of a variety of different kinds of technologies. And of course, I've written quite a bit about those who are most vulnerable and people who I see as the forgotten or in the crosshairs of the way in which technology is designed, and ultimately the people who pay the highest price in the world for the kinds of technologies that we have today. And so I want to just, in that spirit, say that we're living in a moment where all over the world, there's an outpouring and an outcry for Black Lives Matter, for justice for George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery. We see that all over the world, people are both using technology to connect and to protest and to bolster the calls for police accountability for those who murder Black people, and also to defund the police. And certainly many campaigns are being organized around the world vis-a-vis technology. But we have to ask ourselves also, what has become of the way in which hate groups are able to easily organize online and propagate the kind of disinformation that in fact, has led to the incredible dehumanization, or certainly at least is deeply implicated in the dehumanization of the most vulnerable in our societies around the world. And so when I think about what does designing technology for good mean, then that means we center the people who are most harmed. And I think that one of the naivetes that we see coming out of many silicon corridors around the world is a sensibility of kind of a very esoteric, philosophical framework of good. In fact, while I've watched for the past decade, not only myself and my own work, but the writing of many of my colleagues who are women, who are feminists, women of color, LGBTQ, scholars and journalists who've been talking about the harms of various types of digital technologies and the internet for at least 30 years, but certainly in a concentrated way for the past decade, those criticisms and those arguments are off about kind of the harms, the good and the bad. If we have to work in that kind of simple binary, I think it's more complex than that. But I'll say, we see those arguments that many of us have made being taken up now and put into these frameworks of ethics that, quite frankly, defang and depoliticize the very things that we were talking about, which is to what degree are these platforms in particular implicated in the undermining, erosion, and in some places the collapsing of democracy? To what degree are they implicated in real harms? And I'm not just talking about adjudicating a meme. I'm talking about being the vessels and the microphones and the amplifiers at a global scale for calls for hate and harm. So these are the kinds of things that I'm interested in talking about with you today as we kind of open up the conversation about the role of these technologies in our society.
Love it. Thank you. Thomas.
Thank you very much. And Sarah, it's a pleasure to join you and Safiya on the stage. I think Safiya's teed this conversation up fantastically, and I'm looking forward to getting into it as well. As by way of an introduction to myself, I used to be the executive director of Article 19, which is an international human rights charity that focuses on freedom of expression. But as of about February this year, I took over the role, or I took on the new role of Director of Administration for the Oversight Board. Now, the Oversight Board is a new body that's comprised of independent members from around the world, and their role will be to make binding decisions on what content Facebook and Instagram should allow or remove based on respect for freedom of expression and human rights. And as mentioned, my role is to run the administration, and the administration will be supporting the board members as they deliberate on key cases. I thought it would be useful probably to start this conversation just by noting that I am not an employee of Facebook, and I do not answer to Facebook. Facebook's reputational or commercial interests play no role in my work, and nor do they in the decisions that the board will take. I think it's also useful to note that the board is at its core a deliberative body. It's not an advocacy body. And its relevance and impact will be on the cases that it hears and the decisions that it will take. So as compelling and pressing and urgent as any current event may be, the board is not being set up to take or make commentary on those issues. So the analogy is really of a deliberative body, like a court or a grievance mechanism, in which actually you would argue that if any such body made a comment on an ongoing event that they hadn't heard as a case yet, they would actually prejudice their ability to be able to hear that case. The other thing I think that's worth mentioning is that the board is not there to replace Facebook in terms of its decisions around its own community standards. It's there to comment on and take decisions around cases. Of course, the difference being that it will apply in addition to community standards, international human rights standards, with the huge caveat and issue of how do you go about doing that. And it will do that both by taking cases that have been appealed by users, as well as referred to it by Facebook and Instagram.
Thank you. Well, I'd love to start by taking us back to the title. What does good look like in a techno-society? Often these conversations imagine that we start from scratch, but we don't. We're painting a watercolor in a stream, both in terms of the tech that's embedded into our lives, but also the existing social structures that are subverted and amplified by the technologies and how they're designed. Good is completely subjective and impossible to consider neutrally. And Safiya, to your point, ethics often strips the political out of this conversation, right? It divorces what we know to be true from the systems that live behind it. So I'm curious to get both of your feedback on how do we approach this topic? You know, when we're thinking about what good looks like, how can this, you know, surely this needs to be an evolving definition defined by a set of different stakeholders over time. Is this the wrong question to be asking ourselves right now? I'm just curious about your thoughts on that.
Well, I think we have to be talking about the implications of these technologies. One of the challenges with framing this as a matter of good versus evil, of course, or it's just a matter of ethics, is that ethics become a very personal kind of unit of analysis, let's say, or unit of intervention. So people talk about how they personally, as a programmer or as an executive, can do good. And I think that's the neoliberal argument, of course, which is that all interventions are personal and private and a matter of our own internal mental processes or our fortune, our good luck, but it certainly, again, defangs us from having a structural analysis, which many of these platforms and technologies that we're talking about are deeply structural. When you talk about a platform, for example, in my own work, I study Google for the most part, and I can say that when you have a company that's a global multinational advertising platform become the new arbiter of fact, the ultimate fact-checking machine, then you really shift the landscape structurally of how we come to know knowledge, let alone information, and disambiguating that from advertising or propaganda, which also flows through a platform like that. If we're talking about Facebook, we're talking about effectively undermining any attempts at a public media landscape and centralizing and concentrating news media in particular into one space, which of course we know that many people around the world are reliant upon Facebook for knowing what's going on in the world. So it's really woefully insufficient to talk about good at the level of what I'm going to do as a particular employee, although we've seen just here recently, employees from both Google, Facebook, Amazon, from all of the big tech companies walking out in protest, really understanding that these are company level decisions and they have global impact. And the behavior of one at the top or two at the top has tremendous import. So I think we're going to have to sit down and figure out, as a public, as varying publics around the world, to what degree will we allow these types of platforms to ultimately, in my opinion, undermine democratic institutions? And this is something that I'm kind of interested in talking about with you today, for sure.
To that point, Thomas, there's something really interesting here around governance, right? Like the timelines that any kind of participatory process, democracy, justice, etc., necessarily takes, and the speed that software moves in. Thomas, I think I'm curious to learn more about how you designed the accountability board and how that came to be. And then I'd love to open this question up more broadly around how do we think about better checks and balances, not just at the kind of state level, but also what other mechanisms could we use to ensure that there is better governance processes in place?
Thanks. Let me just reflect for a second on what Safiya said, because I agree. I very much agree. Social media, technology in general, tends to be a reflection of society. Trying to interpret what good is, and particularly versus evil, is obviously extremely subjective. And Sarah, I think this builds to your next question, which is certainly from my own experience and my own work over the last 20 years, trying to devise and agree on frameworks for what is good is extremely hard. But nevertheless, we do have a set of principles and values around international human rights. They are not necessarily perfect, but they have been elaborated over many, many decades. Of course, they do need to be applied to the digital era, and much work has been done by many individuals to try and do that and to take that forward. But when I think about a framework that I would like to see applied in the digital realm, it's that framework. It's international human rights standards. And as I say, they do not provide an answer to every single context, and they certainly do not provide possibly even fully satisfactory outcomes for all situations. But in terms of a global framework that is universally recognized and is adaptable and applicable, that would be my goal. And in answer to your question, digital disruption obviously has a few key components to it. One of which is it enormously accelerates all of these processes. And traditionally, democratic processes and judicial processes, for that matter as well, happen at a much, much slower pace. So it's trying to understand how to create something that can respond, if not in real time, then as rapidly as possible. And what we're trying to do with the Oversight Board is to build structures and mechanisms that allow responses within days or weeks, rather than months or years, as you may see with a court system. But that's in recognition of the fact that this is taking place in the digital realm and taking place at an enormous scale. And so some of those challenges are just replicated in the same way. And you know, we're still working through what these processes will exactly look like. But obviously, the issues of scale and speed are forefront in our minds.
Yeah, I'm just curious about, it seems impossible to divorce the outcomes. Yeah, I think particularly with the Oversight Board, noting that it's new, noting that we haven't, that it's the members were only very recently announced. It seems really impossible to divorce the outcomes from the business models. And I think this is what Safiya was getting to, is that ultimately with Google being funded by advertising, there's no, you know, the incentive is not to have the trust, the right information at the top. The incentive is to keep people coming back time and time again. And I'm just curious about, do we believe self-regulation really is possible? I know that the Oversight Board is a great test in this case, and I think tests need to exist, but I'm just curious for both of you, you know, is self-regulation by tech companies sufficient? Haven't these companies had enough chances? I'm just thinking particularly of the last couple of weeks with social media, like how is self-regulation possible, I guess?
Please.
I would say proper self-regulatory structures for content on social media have not been properly tested yet. So when you say, have they had enough chances, maybe it's been too long until this has been created and tried for the first time, but I don't think there's been too many chances. And when I say proper self-regulation, I don't mean companies left to regulate themselves and their content within their own structures. That's not what I would consider to be proper self-regulation. I mean independent, transparent, multi-stakeholder, external regulation of content, where the body that has been set up is independent, can publish its findings, and will hold that entity to account. And that is exactly the intention of the Oversight Board. And if you look at the members of the board themselves, many names you'll have recognized, of course. I know from having spoken to them all, that's exactly their intent as well. And many of them have been critical of Facebook over the past, and they will continue to do so. Now, it's not, I don't want to pretend in any way that the board will be able to review every single case. Of course it won't, because they will be measured in their many hundreds of thousands. So the board will look for cases that are both impactful, but also have the ability to be replicated in terms of the decisions that they take. But I do believe this is an innovative process. I don't believe this has been tried before, and I do think it will work. I do think it can create the kind of transparency and accountability that should be applied vis-a-vis content to social media.
If I may, I just want to say, I think, you know, the challenge here is that the unit of analysis, again, of talking about what's happening through these platforms and technologies as if they are matters of content and adjudicating content. And just to say that, you know, the word content really flattens what we're talking about here. And of course, I, you know, think about my colleague, Sarah Roberts at UCLA and her work in interviewing commercial content moderators, and in my own conversations with witnessing the adjudication of content and talking to people who are in fact making executive decisions of a life or death matter. For example, in the case of the murder of Philando Castile, you know, would we know about a product called Facebook Live had Diamond Reynolds not captured his murder by the police on Facebook Live and broadcasted? And dare I say, every day, moderators are looking at content of this nature that leaves people's lives hanging in the balance. And so for me, I guess I locate the expertise with the people who are making these decisions, the people who are incredibly harmed. Of course, we know about Alex Hearn's important article at The Guardian that I read this morning, and the work of Foxglove and others who are trying to help us understand that content is not actually just if there's looting, there's shooting kinds of decisions to adjudicate, but there are actually decisions about the propagation of real harm, the matter of whether help, ambulances, all kinds of emergency response can happen. That is what we're talking about also when we're talking about so-called content. And I think that this is one of the challenges when we talk about making decisions at the level of regulatory bodies, independent or otherwise. We're talking about apples and oranges. The real experts are the people who are making decisions that impact us in real time in life or death situations, and most likely involve Black and brown moderators, Black and brown people who are in the crosshairs of the harm. And so for me, it's really insufficient to talk about any kind of, it doesn't mean we don't need the regulatory frameworks, but no one's paying the kind of attention. And I was really thrilled to see Foxglove and Corey Kreider in particular, who's a human rights lawyer and investigative journalist, really turning our attention to this, along with other scholars who've been doing this, because that is also a site of tremendous power and expertise. And maybe the question is whether some of these products and platforms should even exist, rather than talking about the kind of content that moves through them.
It's also worth noting that the average content moderator earns $15 an hour. Not only is this group disproportionately diverse, but they're also not benefiting from the sheer salaries that we think of in tech companies. Yeah, that's a particular topic of interest, Safiya. I think that's I thought Foxglove this morning, a bunch of Facebook content moderators formed their own coalition and went live with it, which I would encourage anyone following this to check out. A very powerful post, I thought. I think that's a really interesting point, right? Should these platforms exist? But also, going back to the conversation we had right at the beginning of this conversation, how do we center the most impacted? Not just to your point, Safiya, it's Black and brown moderators looking at Black and brown racism, harms, etc. There's been a really interesting conversation happening in the last 2 weeks around Black VC, for example. Just every area of the tech industry has been examined and found to be wanting, pretty much. I want to kind of go down the route, first of all, of centering the most impacted, or the group that should be in the room when we decide, when this group decides on how to move forwards. But I want to come back to this piece around, should these companies exist? What would digital public infrastructure look like? As an ex-BBC employee, I'm very excited by that kind of thing. But let's start with this piece around, it's an incredibly well-known long-term problem that the 10 people who get to make and benefit from the largest tech platforms all look exactly the same, have very similar backgrounds. At the beginning of this conversation, we talked about who should drive the next wave of technology forwards, or whether these are citizens, governments, makers, etc. How do we ensure this group does not replicate existing power structures?
Well, we can't be sure, because one of the things we know is that the people who are in the opportunity pool are in fact people who went to the same schools, share the same socioeconomic class background for the most part, are demographically, racially, and ethnically, and gender similar. So that's the current problem that, of course, we're trying to intervene upon. Of course, that makes assumptions that just if you just ethnically and racially and by gender and class diversify the work pool and the decision makers, that will solve it. It doesn't necessarily address the fundamental concern about to what degree will predictive analytics, which quite frankly is what we're talking about when we talk about digital technologies, to what degree will these digital technologies over-determine our future? And so this is where I think, it's not just about the representation in the room. Of course, that's important. But the question is, and I think about Jeff Larson and Julia England's work at Truthout when they were looking at recidivism prediction software, for example. And ultimately what they found was it was 3 guys who'd rented some space in a strip mall and had made this predictive software that was deeply racist and put people in prison for long periods of time. And, would we ever allow in other industries, for example, 3 guys to rent some space, batch up some chemicals, roll it out in Walgreens or CVS or Duane Reade or all of the stores around the world, the drugstores. And then when it fails, when people die, we say, oh, well, that was just chemistry. And they're not really responsible because they're not the makers of the elements I mean, this is ludicrous, but that is actually the kind of logic that we have when we talk about digital technologies that come into existence, that we don't know until after they exist. And people have been harmed. Their children have been taken away from them. In the case of the incredible research of Virginia Eubanks and others, these are really important decisions. And these are products and predictive analytics that come into the marketplace, that it is after the fact, after the harm is done. And if we are lucky enough to get the attention of anyone who will care, that we might be able to get them taken down, but in more cases, not. So I think that we have to ask ourselves, why don't we have the equivalent in the US? We have something called the Food and Drug Administration. We have other types of regulatory bodies that decide whether something should exist, because these things, once you let them loose, it's very difficult to call them back. And I think these are the more interesting questions in my own research, I'll say.
I mean, I think there's been a lot of progress over the last few years, certainly looking at ethical standards around AI, and certainly looking at the intersection between AI and human rights, although it's still a very fledgling area, despite some good initiatives. But the fundamental challenge here is that we're talking at essence, when we look at content, about the intersection between what is a fundamental human right and therefore the type and scope of regulation that should be applied to it is not the same as necessarily in other industries or other sectors. Otherwise, you start to restrict that right. And Sarah, going back to your point, also being a Brit, looking at the fantastic entity, sorry, very subjective, but a fantastic entity that is the BBC, that is not the norm around the world. Public service media, or for that matter, truly neutral, unbiased public service social media, I think is a misnomer. I don't think that could exist. And if you ask me what kind of balance or ecosystem I would like to function in, I would say one where there is dominant statutory or governmental control is not one that I want to be in. I would like to be in one where there is parity and balance between a variety of different actors. Certainly, I agree that social media, there needs to be more transparency and accountability, more public reporting around those issues. But I would not like to see a situation in which there is much heavier direct governmental control of content on social media, because I think that will lead to restrictions. And I've spent many years, decades, campaigning against exactly that type of restriction. And in countries which do not have strong rule of law, the implications are immediate. The dominant group who will be in government will repress and suppress the other communities. And it happens time and time again. So I do not think we should be living in a world either where private actors are absolutely dominant over all other actors, but there needs to be a balance. I think part of what Safiya is pointing out, and I agree with, is that in that equation, users are too often forgotten, and particularly vulnerable and marginalized groups are too forgotten and often pay the price. And again, one of the things that the Oversight Board will be focused on is how to engage those communities and how to make sure that when it comes to content, their voices are heard and their needs are better represented and met through respect for human rights by these platforms, or by Facebook and Instagram.
I mean, I really agree with you, Thomas, in this sense that repressive regimes are more likely to be abusers of, this so-called attempt at, democratic technologies or public infrastructures. And I do believe in those. I do believe they're important. The challenge we have, for example, in the US is that we don't have, we have a collusion between government and big tech, and we have a defunding of democratic institutions, democratic public institutions, vis-a-vis, in fact, quite frankly, the tech industry, because it doesn't pay taxes, for example. So it defunds by effectively taking their tax revenues out of the system. They defund public education, they defund public libraries, they defund public health, they defund public media. These are the democratic institutional counterweights to corporate control over what we think of as our media and communications infrastructure or our knowledge infrastructures. So I think there is a really important balance that must be played. And one of them could just be at a very minimal level of intervention would be for the public tax coffers to be filled by the companies that in fact extract so much from the public, whether it's our public infrastructure, our roads, our highways, our post office, our best students, taking them out of the economy, so to speak, the public economy, and in the bolstering of public goods and privatizing. We see huge transfers of wealth of public assets going into the hands of corporations, and certainly COVID-19 and the pandemic has been a pretext for quite a bit of that. So I think it's really, again, when we get to like these conversations at the minutia where we're talking about users, it's difficult for me to think that that's the site of intervention, because these structural dimensions of, in fact, funding authoritarian regimes and their backers off the backs of the public is a place we have to keep at the forefront of the conversations when we talk about balance.
Mm-hmm. Especially in an era when newsrooms are being decimated. I think that's something I worry about an awful lot. I know that we only have 10 minutes left, so I want to shift gears a little bit and ask you both what gives you optimism looking to the future. I want to ask you that first of all, and then come back to institutions and organizations that you think are doing great work right now. Thomas, do you want to start?
I mean, I'm always enthused when I see any movement that is fighting for a particular cause or fighting for justice, and we see that around the world. Certainly, we see that in the United States, but we see that around the world. So where we see activism, then I think there is cause for optimism, and there is innovation across many different areas. I'm of course going to focus in the oversight board, but I think there are other examples as well. But I do think, as I mentioned earlier, that it is something new, it's something innovative. To use a British saying, that the proof is in the pudding. So, we'll have to demonstrate that it works and it's effective and it can be impactful for users. But that's exactly the intention of the board members and of myself. So that's where I would place my optimism for the future.
I'm also very optimistic. 10 years ago, when I was writing about and talking about things like racism and sexism embedded in platforms and technologies, people told me that was absolutely impossible. And they argued that point of view down. And now, of course, everyone can see the implications of what I'm talking about and what others have been talking about. And so I'm heartened to see that these conversations have moved to the center, to the fore. I think those are part of the way in which we can start to talk about regulation, for example. So I'm also heartened that there are issues around structural racism, around global inequality, which quite frankly, these technologies are deeply implicated in. And we're able to have a vocabulary and research to parse that and to talk about that. And of course, as people are in the streets right now all over the world calling for justice for Black lives, I think that we will be able to also talk about the strengthened militarized police state, for example, that we're all witnessing on our screens around the world. All of these kinds of things are implicated in this conversation. And I'm also very optimistic that people see it's not a world they want to live in. People want a different kind of world where there isn't mass global inequality and hate, to name a few. So I feel very optimistic, and I see so many women of color, scholars and journalists, quite frankly, where our ideas are getting taken up. And I think when you look to people who are in the margin, people who are in the crosshairs, in their own lived experience, you can learn a lot. I'm hopeful that our work will continue to be supported, and that public journalism and investigative journalism will also be supported. To bring these things into view so that we can talk about them more fully. And I'm really grateful we had an opportunity to have this conversation today.
And so what noting that we have to go to Q&A quite soon, what kind of organizations, institutions, individuals, particularly, I would love to get your recommendations for people who've tuned into this conversation. Who is leading the charge, not necessarily in defining good, but in doing work in this space that people should be aware of? We've already mentioned a couple of brilliant people like Corey Crider at Fox Club, for example, Sarah Roberts. But it'd be wonderful to get your recommendations of who you think is leading at the forefront of this, beyond the two of you, of course.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to say Safiya. No, in addition to, I think I would probably call out. I mean, amongst a range and an enormous number of people who, over the last years, I think have really led the charge on this, particularly from the international human rights perspective. I'm going to call out the outgoing UN Special Rapporteur David Kaye, who I'm sure many people have heard of, who has really set the tone on the debate in terms of technology and human rights, put out a number of extremely important reports, and pushed the United Nations to really take this and put it center of agenda, and I think has made enormous progress.
Yeah, I would agree. I think David is excellent. And I would obviously, our role, Sarah Roberts and I at UCLA, we have a new Center for Critical Internet Inquiry where we're trying to bolster the voices who are deeply invested in these conversations too. Certainly, I think of people like the collective that's been organized out of NYU, the Critical Race and Digital Studies group. We've been working very hard to amplify critique and also understanding and intervention. I think of legal scholars like Frank Pasquale, Kelly Lytle Hernandez, our MacArthur genius, who writes about $1 million hoods and the way in which technologies, vis-a-vis mass incarceration technologies and otherwise, are extracting from Black and brown neighborhoods all over. I think of Julia Powell's and her important work around health data and health surveillance and extraction. I may have mentioned Frank Pasquale. So these are people, Ruha Benjamin, Meredith Broussard, of course. These are my colleagues and my sisters, and I think they're doing great. Marie Hicks. These are the names of the people that I call upon when there's deep work to do.
Amazing. That was a who's who of incredible thinkers there. So final question. With CogX, we have a really interesting blended audience. We have a decent amount of tech workers and investors and people in this room that listening who are building companies right now. What message would you have for them as they're approaching their work, as they're trying to fix what's already out there? What would your guidance be?
I'll let Thomas have the last word. So I'll just say quickly that in my book, one of the things I really call upon tech leaders to do is to hire people with graduate degrees in Black studies, gender studies, Chicano Latino studies, Indigenous studies, American Indian studies, people with liberal arts and social science, humanities backgrounds, and make them equals and peers with engineers. Because the thing I often tell my students, my computer science students, is you have no business designing for technology for society, and you know nothing about society. So putting people who are deep experts in society would be a really just practical way that people working in Silicon Valley could make a difference.
That's good for me being a liberal arts graduate.
I'm going to completely agree with that. I think everyone has to take responsibility. If there are downsides, then they're not just someone else's problem. Everyone has to step in. Things like educating engineers in ethics about biases, unconscious or otherwise, building a truly diverse workforce, and so on. I mean, Safiya's pointed out that's not the solution to the problem in unto itself, but certainly important steps forward. I would ask individuals to commit to and make public their pledges on what they're doing around human rights standards and how they're going to operationalize those. And I would say to any tech business leader, if you're not familiar with them, please spend 10 minutes, read the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, particularly think about Principle 31, and think about how you're implementing that, how you're going to make that a reality in your company.
Brilliant. Thanks, both of you. So we have a 15-minute break now, and we will meet anyone who wants to join us in the Q&A breakout session. It feels as if we barely scratched the surface. I'd love to hand back over to Carly Kind. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you so much, Safiya and Thomas, for that really fascinating panel. I could listen to the two of you debate those issues for many more hours, and in fact, I will in the Q&A area. But thank you, and I think Safiya's final challenge was one of the most important takeaways from today, and I hope those in the audience from the tech community who heard it will recall it, which is hire people who know something about society, hire experts in sociology, anthropology, lawyers, ethics. I think that's a really important conclusion from that panel. Thank you also to Sarah for excellent moderation. As Sarah said, there's going to be a short break now, and then you can join the panelists for Q&A. You can find the Q&A session at the CogX portal, and they'll be kicking that off, yes, in about 15 minutes time. We'll also be kicking off another panel here on this stage in 15 minutes time, which is called the Ethics Panel to End All Ethics Panels. And yes, that is as sexy and exciting as it sounds. So please join us for that, or join us for the Q&A for this interesting session. Thanks again for being here. Cheers.
Want access to more CogX videos? Subscribe now for free at cogx.co.